All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. It's 12:30. Thank you all, first of all, for joining me on what should otherwise be your lunch hour. I hope you find some time to get food today. I probably won't. But that being said, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Ian Foss. I'm a program specialist at the U.S. Department of Education, where I've worked since 2010, almost nonstop working on implementing the PSLF and now TEPSLF programs. So hopefully you find what I'm about to say informative. We are going to start with an overview of the programmatic requirements for the PSLF program. I'll take you through some of what we've done in terms of implementation of the program. We'll talk about some data that we have around the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. We'll segue into talking briefly about the TEPSLF program, which if you hadn't already heard about, you heard about this morning at the federal update. Before we close it out by talking about some new resources that we have coming out very soon. So starting with PSLF basics. To receive public service loan forgiveness, a borrower needs to make 120 qualifying payments on direct loans while in a qualifying repayment plan, while working full-time for a qualifying employer, which they must do not only while they're making the 120 payments, but also when they apply for and ultimately receive public service loan forgiveness. And so at its face, that all seems very straightforward and simple. But as we delve deeper into the details, I think what you'll all learn, if you haven't already, is that the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is really anything but simple. One sort of disclaimer before we move forward about the taxation of public service loan forgiveness: it is not taxed at all. According to the Internal Revenue Service, amounts forgiven due to public service loan forgiveness are not income, and so no taxes due. Let's start by talking about what loan programs and loan types are eligible for PSLF. I said, of course, on the prior slide that all direct loans are eligible, but for those of you who have been around for a while, you'll know that there are or were other programs that are called federal student loan programs, namely the Perkins Loan Program and the Federal Family Education Loan Program. Loans made under those programs are not eligible for public service loan forgiveness, which isn't to say that a borrower cannot make those loans eligible. They can, and they can do that by way of loan consolidation into the direct loan program. But only payments that borrowers who consolidate make on their new direct consolidation loan can count towards forgiveness, which means that if you make payments on a loan while you're working for a qualifying employer and then consolidate it, you lose all of the time that you had spent earning towards public service loan forgiveness. I have an asterisk here with respect to direct Parent Plus loans. Technically, they are direct loans, and so technically they qualify. But as we'll talk about in a little while, those loans effectively need to be consolidated in order for a Parent Plus borrower to be eligible to receive PSLF because of the repayment plans for which Parent Plus loans are eligible and the qualifying repayment plans for PSLF. Qualifying employment is probably the single biggest component of public service loan forgiveness. It's in the name, right? So unlike a lot of other federal student loan forgiveness programs or other loan repayment or loan forgiveness programs, public service loan forgiveness doesn't care about your actual job for your employer. It cares about the nature of your employer itself. So if you are employed by a government organization at any level, federal, state, local, tribal, if you're employed by a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, or if you're employed by certain other not-for-profit organizations that are not 501c3s and which provide certain qualifying services as part of their primary purpose, they are also qualifying employers for the purposes of public service loan forgiveness. You'll see this a little bit later in the presentation, but this last category of qualifying employment almost never happens. It happens so infrequently that when we produce aggregate numbers about it, the number of employers that have been approved round down to 0 when producing percentages. So it's very rarely ever seen. So if you're trying to come up with a sort of snapshot view of what qualifies, it's government employers and 501c3s. Technically others too, but it rarely happens. You also need to be employed full-time by your qualifying employer when you're making each of your qualifying payments. Generally, our definition of what is full-time defers to the employer's definition of full-time, but if for whatever reason the employer is frankly pretty cool and defines full-time as something that's less than 30 hours per week, we're not going to defer to that definition of full-time. So stated differently, full-time for the purposes of PSLF is the greater of 30 hours per week or whatever your employer considers to be full-time. So if you're like me and your employer says that 40 hours per week is full-time, you have to work 40 hours per week to be considered full-time for the purposes of PSLF. There are a few other nuances with respect to full-time employment, most notably for those who work multiple part-time jobs, both of which qualify. The hours that they work at each job can sort of be added together in order to get the borrower from a part-time status to a full-time status. And when borrowers are combining multiple part-time jobs to be considered full-time, we hold them to a 30-hour per week standard for full-time employment. Qualifying repayment plans. 10-year standard repayment plan is at the top of this list, and technically that's right, but you need to forget about it because it's not the thing that you want to do if you are trying to get public service loan forgiveness. If you want to actually receive public service loan forgiveness, you would need to change into an income-driven repayment plan or an IDR plan. There are 4 of them. If you want to hear me talk for a whole other 90 minutes, you can listen to me talk about income-driven repayment in this room right after this. But by way of preview, the 4 income-driven repayment plans are income-based repayment or IBR, income contingent repayment or ICR, PAYE or pay-as-you-earn, and revised pay-as-you-earn or repay. The reason why this is true, and for those of you who have been around student loans for a while, this won't come as a surprise, the 10-year standard repayment plan is a repayment plan that calculates your monthly payment in an amount that ensures that your loan is repaid in full in 10 years. Public service loan forgiveness requires 120 qualifying payments. That's 10 years of payments. So technically, a borrower could sit out on the 10-year standard repayment plan for 10 years and qualify for PSLF in the amount of $0 because their loan would be paid in full. Of course, this is all established in statute, and I don't really know why this is considered a qualifying repayment plan at all. Personally, when I try to come up with a reason for why it's true, the 10-year standard repayment plan is the default repayment plan for student loans. If you don't choose another one when your loan's into repayment, you're placed into this plan. And so for those borrowers who maybe make payments under a 10-year standard plan before they really realize that they need to change into a plan, this sort of acts as a grandfathering mechanism for the payments that they already made under the 10-year standard plan. Again, technically, there's another sort of category of qualifying repayment plan where if the payment amount is at least as much as it would have been under the 10-year standard repayment plan, that those payments can also qualify, but frankly, in the history of our implementation of this program, we've never actually seen it happen. So again, to get PSLF, you need to get on IDR, and we can move on from there. Qualifying payments. We're talking about 120 separate monthly payments. That means that you can't simply write us a check for 10 years worth of payments at the beginning of your loan repayment period and get forgiveness. You need to marry your payments with your employment over the course of 10 years or 120 months in order to receive public service loan forgiveness. Only payments made after October 1st, 2007 can qualify for forgiveness. That is the primary, or really the only reason why no borrower theoretically could have ever been eligible for PSLF until 2017, because payments made prior to that time don't count, even if they were made while they were at a qualifying employer. The payments don't need to be consecutive, though. So a borrower could be in qualifying employment and make a month or 12 months of payments, leave for a non-qualifying employer, and then come back in later in time, and they don't start over from zero. They pick right back up where they left off. Payments to qualify must be for the full amount due under your repayment plan. So if you get a bill that says you owe us $100 and you only pay $50, that's not paying the full amount due. You need to pay the full $100 in my example as shown on your bill in order to get credit towards PSLF. And then lastly, and in a very common sense way, payments must be made on time, which we define for our purposes as being within 15 days of the due date. Here's where things get a little bit more complicated than the prior slide. Borrowers don't always simply make their payment for the full amount due on their due date every month. They do a variety of different things. Some of them make half their payment every time they get paid to help manage their cash flow. Some of them use their tax return to try to pay down their student loan balance. And all of those types of borrower behaviors can affect whether or not a borrower is able or has made a qualifying payment. And so for the borrower, in my example, who maybe makes a payment twice a month every time he or she gets paid, we will add up all of the payments that they make generally over the course of the month. And if the sum of all of their payments for that month equal the full amount that they owed us, they'll get credit for one qualifying payment for that 1 month's student loan payment obligation that they've satisfied. But payments made when they are not required don't count. So when are payments not required? When your loans are under deferment or forbearance, before your loans have entered repayment, and so are in an in-school status or an in-grace status, payments that you have made when your loans are significantly what we call paid ahead, because you've paid us so far in advance that we've eliminated your obligation to make payments on your loan for the future. We have a few exceptions to this kind of rule with respect to what we call lump sum payments for those who have served in AmeriCorps, those who have served in Peace Corps, and more recently, certain borrowers who are working for an agency under the auspices of the Department of Defense, who sort of have some student loan repayment benefits that accrue to them for their employment. And so in our regulations, we've made exceptions to allow these relatively large payments that come in to provide credit for more than one monthly payment. And so now that I've overwhelmed you with all of the programmatic requirements of public service loan forgiveness, I'm going to try to demonstrate all of these requirements and how they actually operate in practice with the ever-alliterative Billy Borrower. Billy Borrower is single, and he has no dependents, and he lives in Georgia because we're in Georgia. He has an adjusted gross income of $35,000 a year, which rises at the rate of 5% a year. If you're thinking that sounds like an unreasonable assumption to make, I think that would probably be right. I know I don't get a 5% raise every year. But the reason why we make this assumption is because it mimics one of the tools that we have available right now, which makes some of the same assumptions. And so to provide parity between what you may see in the slide deck and what you see when you use some of our tools, I'm going to be unreasonable. Billy has $50,000 in direct loan debt, $23,000 of which is subsidized, and all of it, because I promise it makes the math a whole lot simpler, has an interest rate of 6%. And I'll explain why this matters a little bit in a while, although it probably doesn't so much for PSLF. He borrowed for graduate school as well. So what you see on this slide is a comparison between what would have happened if Billy had repaid his loans under an income-driven repayment plan using everything that I just said on the prior slide, but did not pursue PSLF. That's at the top. If he combines income-driven repayment with public service loan forgiveness, those are the numbers that you see on the bottom. Now remember, income-driven repayment plans generally set payments based on income and family size. And so there's no guarantee that anybody's loans are going to be repaid in full, first of all, ever, or second of all, within a fixed period of time. And so even though you may know that most income-driven repayment plans generally provide forgiveness in their own right after 20 or 25 years, some borrowers, and this is true in some cases for Billy, will never actually reach that far without public service loan forgiveness. So let's look at income contingent repayment and income-based repayment first. Billy spends 15 and 19 years respectively in repayment under those two repayment plans, which means that he has paid somewhere between $95,000 and $115,000 roughly over the course of that period of time between the two plans. But because his loans are paid in full before the end of 25 years, which is usually the period of time for income-based and income contingent repayment that he would need to pay in order to receive loan forgiveness under income-driven repayment itself, again, ignoring public service loan forgiveness for the moment, he would not receive forgiveness under those repayment plans at all. But when you look at those two repayment plans, at the bottom part of this slide, where he combines income-driven repayment with public service loan forgiveness, not only does he receive loan forgiveness in varying amounts for IBR and ICR at somewhere between $25,000 and $55,000 roughly, he'll receive it in certainly less time, 10 years. Again, this is assuming Billy does literally everything right with respect to income-driven repayment and public service loan forgiveness, and we'll talk later about why that's not always true. But he also pays less, significantly less, over the course of that 10 years than he would have done under income-based and income contingent repayment without public service loan forgiveness. Again, just looking at IBR by itself, it's a difference of, $60,000, I think, doing some rough math here, in the total amount paid when Billy repays under IBR alone versus repaying under IBR and coupling IBR with PSLF. And then that pattern is just borne out for pay-as-you-earn and revised pay-as-you-earn, where the same general trend continues. The difference between pay-as-you-earn and revised pay-as-you-earn and ICR and IBR is that under those final two plans, pay and repay, Billy actually does have a remaining balance left after 20 or 25 years for those two plans under income-driven repayment alone, but he pays significantly more over time to get it. And he has far less forgiven when you compare that to what he would stand to pay and have forgiven when pay-as-you-earn and revised pay-as-you-earn are coupled with public service loan forgiveness. And so there's this fundamental relationship between public service loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment. PSLF isn't for everybody. It's not even for everybody who happens to work in a qualifying job, or rather for a qualifying employer. The economics of public service loan forgiveness makes sense inherently only for a borrower for whom income-driven repayment otherwise already made economic sense. Otherwise, borrowers might see their payments go up under an income-driven repayment plan relative to the 10-year standard plan or another repayment plan like extended, which may have offered them more repayment relief. And so, again, I think we'll see some of this borne out in the data a little bit later, but we receive a whole lot of forms from a whole lot of borrowers who want public service loan forgiveness, and it's not until they sort of are counseled on how to actually go about getting public service loan forgiveness that they realize, oh, this probably won't actually work for me. So let's talk about those forms. We have two of them. One is called the Employment Certification Form. This is a form that we released in January of 2012, which allows a borrower to proactively, with the help of their employer, get confirmation from us that their loans, employment, and payments qualify for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. The general process works as follows. The borrower submits the form to Fed Loan Servicing, one of our contractors, regardless of who the borrower's current employer is. Fed Loan Servicing determines whether the borrower has direct loans. Again, that is a program requirement for public service loan forgiveness. Fed Loan Servicing will then go through a confirmation process to research whether the borrower's employment qualifies. And if those two criteria are met, direct loans and qualifying employment, Fed Loan Servicing will reach out to whoever has the borrower's loans that are held by the Department of Education and request that they be transferred to Fed Loan Servicing, after which point a borrower, or rather Fed Loan, will go through the, believe it or not, rather arduous process of figuring out what payments made during the period of employment on the form meet all of the complicated rules about qualifying payments. So Fed Loan Servicing will, after that point in time, send the borrower communication that says basically, hey, you've worked for employer X, it qualifies. During this period of time, you've made, Y number of qualifying payments. And when they do this, project an anticipated employment, or rather projected PSLF forgiveness date, which basically says, if we know everything there is to know about you with respect to PSLF right now, and if you continue to do everything right, here's the earliest possible period of time you could be eligible for PSLF. But we don't know what we don't know. And so, first of all, these forms are they're not mandatory. Borrowers are not required to use them. And so we ask that borrowers submit the form early and submit it often, but that count of qualifying payments only ever gets updated if the borrower submits a subsequent form. And so if you submit your form, in year 2, you may have 24 qualifying payments, and Fed Loan Servicing might never ever hear from you again until you apply for public service loan forgiveness as soon as 8 years later. And so, again, you'll see this borne out in the data a little bit later, but to provide you a preview, our data is only as good as borrowers are as good as submitting these forms early and often. These forms implies that there are two, and there are. In addition to the employment certification form, we have a PSLF application. It looks, and the process is almost exactly the same as the employment certification form, because the requirements for applying require that you, among other things, work for a qualifying employer when you apply. So the forms look almost identical, except you're formally requesting for forgiveness from the department. The only real difference between our processes is that Fed Loan Servicing, if they believe that a borrower qualifies for public service loan forgiveness, will forward the borrower's information to Federal Student Aid, where we will make a final determination about whether or not the borrower's loans, employment, and payments qualify for the PSLF program. And assuming that we agree with them, and I think we usually agree with them, then Fed Loan Servicing will receive our approval and go through the process of actually discharging the loan and notifying the borrower. Before I delve into some data, I want to talk about some common issues that we see with respect to submissions of employment certification forms and PSLF applications. The most common problem we see is missing information. In particular, the employment identification number, or TIN, whatever acronym you want to use for it. This is what is on your W-2 every year. It is how the IRS conclusively identifies employers, and it is generally the most reliable indicator of who we have, of who a borrower's employer actually is, and we rely upon that number quite a lot. And so when it's missing, a borrower's form gets rejected. Now, rejected is a scary word, and it doesn't actually mean that the borrower is disqualified from PSLF or can't resubmit their application or their form with the corrected information, but it does mean that they can't move forward in our tracking process or our forgiveness process until they provide us the information that was missing. I've already talked about this, but borrowers tend to not understand that they will only receive updated counts of qualifying payments when they continually submit updated employment certification forms. So going back to my example of the borrower who submits one employment certification form in year 2, their qualifying payment count in our eyes is going to sit at no more than 24 months until they submit another form with an updated period of employment. Another common misconception with respect to the number of qualifying payments a borrower makes is that whether or not payments made to servicers other than Fed loan count. Of course, the answer is yes. It doesn't matter who you made your payment to. It matters whether or not it meets the program criteria of being, on time, full amount due, qualifying plan, etc. Common misconception. Loan types, which are eligible. I cannot tell you the number of letters that I have had to write back to, members of Congress, borrowers who have written to the secretary or the president saying they didn't know that their loans didn't qualify because they heard about PSLF and it was a federal program, so they just assumed that all of their federal student loans would qualify when you all know that it's far more complicated than that. Borrowers tend to not know what loan program they borrowed from. Frequently, when they were in school, they didn't have choice over the matter about which loan program they borrowed from. You either, were in the FEL program or the direct loan program, and borrowers didn't have a choice. And for better or worse, the two loan programs looking very similar, having a lot of the same players and fundamentally having the same terms and conditions, borrowers just have less of a reason to know whether or not they have a direct loan or a loan made under the FEL program. And so one of the single most common rejection reasons we see for PSLF is the borrower doesn't have any direct loans. I talked about this as well with respect to eligible employment, but it bears repeating. PSLF, it doesn't matter what you do, it matters where you work. You could be an administrative assistant, you could be a groundskeeper, you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can be a firefighter. It doesn't matter. It matters that you work for the fire station. It matters that you work for the public charity. It doesn't matter what you do there. Again, qualifying repayment plans. Borrowers have to get on income-driven repayment to receive public service loan forgiveness. Other plans qualify, but you're not getting PSLF unless you change into an income-driven repayment plan. Of course, tying back to the loans that qualify, again, it's only direct loans. Borrower can make loans made under other programs qualify for PSLF by consolidating, but only payments made on the new loan count, even if they made payments that would have otherwise counted on loans that consolidate, and even if they had qualifying employment from prior to when they consolidated. And I don't know if this is so much a misconception other than a thing that we very much like to remind people of. Although the employment certification process is voluntary, it is highly encouraged, not only for the borrower so that they have confirmation that they're doing everything right, and so that they can begin to make more informed life choices about their future employment and payment prospects, but also, frankly, it helps us improve the borrower experience, not only through the ability to counsel borrowers, to target public service loan forgiveness relevant information to borrowers who we know are interested in the program, But it also helps us spread the workload out over the course of 10 years of figuring out what loans, payments, and employers qualify, so that when a borrower eventually wants to receive public service loan forgiveness, we've already done a large chunk of the work, and it reduces the time they have to wait to get an answer from us. We'll do questions at the end. So now for some data before I breeze through TEPSLF. Of course, over time, since January of 2012, these are month-over-month numbers. We have seen the number of borrowers submitting employment certification forms go from nothing when we implemented the program to almost 50,000 repeat submitters a month and about 35,000 new borrowers submitting employment certification forms per month. So the volume of people who are interested in this is growing, and at least some portion of the PSLF population is submitting subsequent ECFs. Employment certification forms, which is good. Of course, these data are a little bit outdated at this point, given how long we have to get our conference presentations up the pipeline for approval. But as of August of this year, we had nearly 1 million, and as of now, we have surpassed 1 million borrowers who have opted into what we call PSLF tracking. These are borrowers who have submitted at least one employment certification form, which has been approved. So again, all of these data that we're talking about right now, and in fact, all of the PSLF data that we're able to provide to everybody only includes people who have opted into our tracking mechanisms. If you're a borrower who's sitting out there and waiting for the end of the 10-year period to apply, you could be interested in PSLF all you want. If we don't know about you through the submission of one of our forms, you're not captured in any of our data. Qualifying employment. This is based on the number of ECFs that we receive and not on borrowers, but as you can see, 501c3s and government make up basically everything that we have approved. All of the other categories of qualifying employment, the other categories of not-for-profit, and some special tracking we do for AmeriCorps and Peace Corps are so minor that they don't even register when we roll it up to a whole percentage. I think you actually need to go out a few decimal places before we even pick up any volume of ECFs that we've approved for the other categories. We have processed a whopping 2.7, basically million employment certification forms. Since we implemented the program, we've had a fairly consistent 2/3 acceptance rate, 1/3 denial rate. Again, denial doesn't mean that you don't qualify for the program. It means there may be something that you might need to do, be it provide us more information or consolidate your loans before you can submit another employment certification form and show up in that approved line. But it does also include people who we determine don't work for a qualifying employer at all, and so might need to change employers if they do want to qualify for PSLF. In terms of the ECFs, the employment certification forms that are rejected, obviously you can see missing or incorrect information is the primary reason that people get rejected. Second up is no eligible loans at almost 1/3. And coming in last, but certainly not least, are people who we've determined don't actually qualify based on their employment. You would be surprised at the number of people who apply for public service loan forgiveness even though they work for a for-profit corporation. It's a lot of them. And we catch those and deny those, certainly, but a huge chunk of the denials that are in this category are for people who work for for-profits or people who work for some other type of not-for-profit corporation that just doesn't qualify because those criteria are far more restrictive than other types. So this is a slide that looks pretty scary. This is a slide that talks about the number of qualifying payments we've determined borrowers have made based on employment certification forms that they've submitted. Of course, we have about 2,000 borrowers who are getting close to or who have at this point ultimately received PSLF, and the numbers sort of slowly expand as we look slope downward towards a borrower having 0 months of qualifying payments. That could be for any number of reasons. Either a borrower just consolidated their loans in order to qualify for PSLF and they submitted an employment certification form right away. As you know, no payments made prior to consolidation can count towards PSLF on the new loan. But also these numbers are only, again, ever updated when borrowers submit subsequent forms. So a lot of this data is kind of stale. I don't frankly know how much it tells us about the number of borrowers who are interested in public service loan forgiveness, but for at least now, it's the best data that we have available. Right. So some other interesting facts, and these are some new data that we've analyzed. It's a little outdated. It was January of 2017 when we ran this. But one thing that we found, which was shocking, but not really shocking, is that the overwhelming majority of borrowers who have an approved employment certification form have only submitted one of them. Over 2/3 of borrowers have only submitted one employment and certification form that has been approved. And of course, it goes down from there. I think I'm in the 5% that has submitted, like 4 or more forms. For borrowers who have submitted only one employment certification form, the average period of employment that's covered by the form, again, this isn't necessarily an indication of how many qualifying payments they've made, it's just how long they've worked for their qualifying employer when they submit, is almost 5 years. And for those borrowers, they submitted that form on average almost 1.5 years ago. So what this tells me is that borrowers are waiting to submit employment certification forms until they are further along in their PSLF journey than we would probably like, and they're not actually submitting these annually. All of that means that we have far more limited insight into borrowers who are interested in PSLF than we would like. If borrowers wait, or if borrowers don't submit these forms regularly, the value of our data are somewhat diminished. Some more interesting data, and again, this can help everybody understand why there are so few borrowers who have qualified for PSLF at this point. You heard Jeff talk about this a while ago at the federal update, but there are 2 primary considerations that affect, we think, why more borrowers haven't qualified. The direct loan program conversion didn't occur until 2010, and frankly, most borrowers had FFEL program loans up until that point in time and didn't start consolidating until after the conversion to direct lending had occurred in 2010. Again, income-driven repayment plans. The direct loan program had the ICR plan around since 1994, but the income-based repayment plan didn't become effective until 2009. So these 2 things put together make it far less likely that borrowers are going to receive PSLF in the first few years when borrowers could theoretically receive forgiveness. And there's some data on this slide that help bear that out. Of borrowers who have submitted at least one employment certification form that's been approved, 71% of them consolidated their loans. That's a lot. There's a further breakdown of what type of loans that they consolidated, but at least the plurality of them consolidated only direct and FFEL program loans, which is not at all surprising to me. Smaller portions of them consolidated only direct loans, and some of them consolidated, about 1/4 of them consolidated only loans made under the FFEL program. So this tells me that the overwhelming majority of borrowers who we know are interested in PSLF today needed to consolidate at least some, if not all, of their loans in order to qualify for the program. But of course, again, when you consolidate, only payments you make on the consolidation loan count. And so we looked back to see what percentage of borrowers had employment data on file from an employment certification form that predated the making of their consolidation loan, and it was more than 3/4. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that had they not consolidated their loans, they would have more qualifying payments, but it shows that borrowers who are interested in PSLF, theoretically, had they figured out what they needed to do sooner, could have been further along in receiving PSLF than they are today, which frankly, at least in my opinion, underscores some of the complexities of this program and how borrowers do or do not understand it. Some other information about why borrowers may not have qualifying payments or more than they would like. About 12% of borrowers interested in PSLF are repaying their loans under a non-qualifying plan. When they do that, Fed loan servicing, again, this is one of the beauties of submitting the employment certification form and our ability to target communications about PSLF to you, is if you are on a non-qualifying plan and you have an approved employment certification form on file, Fed loan servicing tells you that you are on a non-qualifying plan and what you need to do if you really want to receive public service loan forgiveness. And we have a whole host of other borrowers who are in a non-qualifying plan but also in a deferment or forbearance, which suggests that they may be a candidate for moving into income-driven repayment for other reasons. And we have almost 10% of borrowers with an approved employment certification form on file who are in an income-driven plan, but nevertheless have deferred or forborne their payments, even though they're in a qualifying repayment plan. Somewhat interestingly, we have 6.3% of borrowers who don't have any of their loans that have even entered active repayment yet, but happen to be working in qualifying employment and really want us to know about it. So they, of course, have no qualifying payments at this point because their loans haven't entered repayment. But again, it's one of these factors that affect the number of people who have made a certain number of qualifying payments, perhaps fewer than people would have otherwise assumed. We talked about this at the federal update a little bit, so I'm not going to talk about it again. To sum it up, very few borrowers so far have received PSLF as of June. We've forgiven about $5.5 million worth of loans. The main reason that people were denied, and this is not a surprise given all of the data that we've talked about and the complexity of the programs that we've been discussing, is that the borrowers just are not meeting the programmatic requirements. Either they only have FFEL loans, or they were in an extended repayment plan, or some other reason is causing them to not meet the program requirements. And a significant minority were quote unquote rejected for not having enough information in their application or conflicting information that we couldn't resolve. And those borrowers are perfectly free and invited to reapply if they're able to provide us the information we need. So that being said, let's talk about Temporary Expanded PSLF, or TEPSLF, because we're the government and we love acronyms. Congress created the TEPSLF opportunity through two different laws. Both of them were appropriations laws. The formal names are on this slide, but it was the appropriations laws for fiscal year 18 and 19. Basically, what this program or this opportunity does is allow borrowers who don't qualify for PSLF solely because some or all of their payments were made on a non-qualifying plan, like the extended plan, for example, to receive public service loan forgiveness if they meet all of the other requirements and meet some new requirements. But first, some basics about how this will work. Congress has appropriated $700 million for us to administer this opportunity. That's over the course of the 2 fiscal years added together. It was $350 million at a time. The $700 million is not necessarily the amount that we will be forgiving. It's what's known in budgeting terms as the sort of increased subsidy cost to the direct loan program. I could try to explain it to you, but it wouldn't make any sense because I don't know anything about federal budgeting. Ultimately, though, there is a dollar cap on the amount that we can forgive in terms of principal and interest on the loans at $1 billion. And of course, the law required us to implement a process to begin receiving requests for TEPSLF within 2 months of the date that the law was passed. So what you see on this slide is the actual eligibility requirements for TEPSLF. The borrower is eligible if he or she doesn't qualify for PSLF only because some or all of their loans or some or all of their payments were made on a non-qualifying plan, which means that the borrower can't get TEPSLF if they have loans made under the FFEL program. They have to have direct loans in order to receive TEPSLF. We have funds available to expend. That's that $700 million figure. So once that $700 million is spent, this program goes away. We have not hit that $1 billion budget cap. Again, as soon as that cap is hit, and whether we hit the $700 million or the $1 billion cap first, that's when the program expires. And this last one is complicated. So bear with me for a second. The payment that the borrower made 12 months prior to applying for TEPSLF and the payment that they made immediately prior to applying for TEPSLF need to be at least as much as the borrower would have paid had the borrower been on an income-driven repayment plan during that period. So if we take a very simple example, which is not always easy to do, but say the borrower for the last year of their 120 payments was on the extended repayment plan and their payment was $250 a month and they want TEPSLF. Assuming they meet all of our other requirements, we have to evaluate what their IDR payment would have been if they had been in an IDR plan for that final 12 months of payments when they were paying $250. And so if, after we do all of that math with income documentation and certification of family size and everything that goes into figuring out what an income-driven repayment amount is, the IDR payment is less than or equal to $250, then the borrower will pass this criteria and can then go through the full process of figuring out how many payments the borrower has made that qualify with the expanded list of qualifying repayment plans, which includes graduated, extended, extended graduated, consolidation standard, and consolidation graduated. So basically all of the variants of extended and graduated plans. For those who can't pass what we call sort of internally this IDR check for the 12 months prior and the 1 month immediately prior to applying for TEPSLF, if the borrower can demonstrate to us that they've had an unusual fluctuation in their income over the preceding 5-year period, we can perform the IDR check using a more favorable income number that makes it more likely that they will actually pass what, again, we're calling this IDR check. To receive TEPSLF, a borrower needs to do 2 things, at least administratively. They need to have either a PSLF application that's already been denied, and they need to have a PSLF application that they've submitted, but we haven't approved or denied it yet. If they do that, they send a request to TEPSLF at myfedloan.org to request TEPSLF. This has the function of holding the borrower's spot in line, so to speak. Because this is an appropriated program, we have to administer it on a first-come, first-served basis. So when you apply for TEPSLF may affect whether or not you're able to get it, even if you meet all of the other requirements. Ultimately, then, the borrower needs to have been denied PSLF only because some or all payments were on non-qualifying plans, and the borrower needs to provide whatever income documentation we need to figure out what their IDR payment would have been for the purposes of, again, what I call the IDR check. We won't talk about this much because, again, we talked about it at the federal update this morning, but we have received a large number of TEPSLF requests. We have approved very few of them. We have about half of the ones that have made it through to sort of review are still under review. And for the the majority of them that were denied for a non-administrative reason, the overwhelming majority were denied because they didn't meet program requirements. Some of them are pretty obvious, didn't have direct loans, hadn't even been in repayment for 10 years. You can't have made 120 qualifying payments if you haven't been in repayment for 10 years. So there's still obviously a lot of confusion about the PSLF and TEPSLF program because borrowers are reading about it and frankly just applying without fully understanding whether or not it's an opportunity that will work for them. I will say that we have a whole host of other borrowers who applied for TEPSLF but hadn't previously submitted a PSLF application. Their TEPSLF requests are denied immediately, and they are requested to submit one of those applications, after which point they can, of course, send another TEPSLF email to recommence review in earnest of their applications. But so far, we are nowhere close to hitting our $700 million or billion-dollar cap for this program, so it's probably going to stick around for a little while. I'm going to close up before we open it up for questions by talking about some resources, some of which you already know about, some of which you may have heard about, and one of which you have probably not heard anything about at all. I'm going to start with that one. As part of the appropriations law that Congress passed, they also appropriated a specific amount of money for us to improve outreach and what I'm going to call PSLF digitization. We have been using some of that money to build what we call a PSLF help tool, which we will be launching December, I think, 9th of this year. So basically, as soon as we get home from the conference, this tool will be available, or within a week. Basically, this tool will help borrowers understand PSLF. It will specifically tell them whether or not they need to do things like consolidate their loans or put them in an income-driven repayment plan. It will solicit information from the borrower about where he or she works so that they can self-assess eligibility, and it will do so in a way that prevents them from answering irrelevant questions to us through the use of obvious technology like skip logic. It will allow the borrower to input all of the qualifying employers they've ever worked at if they didn't listen to us in terms of submitting the form early and often, so that they can get all caught up with all of their qualifying employment. And it will help the borrower decide which PSLF form to submit, be that the PSLF employment certification form or the PSLF application. What this tool will not do right now is actually have the borrower submit anything. We have not implemented, at least in this initial launch, an ability for borrowers or employers to sign this form, and the information that they provide in this tool will not even be sent to Fed Loan Servicing for the initial launch. What this tool will do is will generate a fully completed PDF that they can save and have signed, however they can sign the PDF, print it out, take it to their employer, etc. But they can do so knowing that they've at least filled the form out as correctly as we can help them do so, and perhaps more importantly, at least at first, tell borrowers if there are other actions that they need to take if they really want to receive public service loan forgiveness. We've talked a lot about borrowers with FFEL loans, borrowers in non-qualifying plans, borrowers in deferment and forbearance wanting to get PSLF, but not understanding that the things that they are doing are preventing them from making progress towards getting forgiveness. So we're hopeful that this tool will go a long way towards helping borrowers understand what they need to do and ultimately complete the forms in a more digital fashion. I have a few early screenshots of what the tool is going to look like from earlier on our development cycle. As you can see, there are a series of questions that we'll ask people. It provides some helpful information about where they should get information that we're asking from them, such as their W-2. And then it tells you, at least for employment, based on what you've told us, it looks like your employment qualifies for PSLF or not, depending on the answers that you provide to us. It also walks through loan eligibility criteria. This will help borrowers understand whether or not they only have direct loans, or if they only have FFEL loans, or if they have a mix. And so in this slide, what you see is what happens if a borrower would need to consolidate some, in this case, or in other cases, all of his or her loans to qualify for PSLF. And though this is just a summary view, the tool will provide a lot more information about what loans need to be consolidated, what loans need to be placed onto an income-driven repayment plan, and even give them a loan level list of loans they need to get onto an IDR plan or loans that they need to consolidate if they want to receive public service loan forgiveness. Again, I mentioned that borrowers will be able to add multiple employers to this tool, and that it will generate the applicable form for each employer that the borrower is submitting employment information for. And so this is just, again, a screenshot of what the tool will look like when the borrower is provided with the opportunity to provide more information about another qualifying employer if they've worked at more than one. And then this is where we help borrowers understand what form we think they should submit and give the borrower the opportunity to say, no, I know better than you, I want this form instead. We're doing sort of rough cut in trying to figure out, at least initially, what form we think a borrower may want to submit. So especially at the beginning, until we get better or more information into this tool, is really a best guess at this time, but the borrower is free to disagree with our decision and generate whatever form they think they want. And that's it for the PSLF help tool. I'm happy to answer any and all questions about this tool or anything else with respect to PSLF. On this slide, there are a variety of links that I would recommend that you all visit, where we provide more information about PSLF and TEPSLF. Another reminder about the TEPSLF mailbox for those who want that. And then another tool that we developed several years ago, if you happen to run into a friend or someone's asking you a question in an elevator and you need someplace to refer them for some sort of actionable steps and don't have a lot of time to explain the way our programs work to them, you can send them to studentloans.gov repay, where in 5 questions or less, we'll try to help set you up with a student loan solution that may work for you. And then a few years ago, we did a blog post that tried to break PSLF down in simpler terms. That is a helpful resource for those of you who may be trying to explain the program to borrowers. So with that, don't be shy. I don't see any microphones in the aisle. So if you could all form lines so I'm not randomly pointing at people, that'd be great. Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Tell me if I'm wrong. I know that every year students are reminded 3 months before their anniversary date, it's time to resubmit an income tax form. Are students being reminded, you've submitted an are you still employed? Are you going to submit? Are they being reminded to do that?
Yeah, so the question, for those who couldn't hear it, is whether or not borrowers are reminded to submit subsequent public service loan forgiveness employment certification forms in the same way that for income-driven repayment, they're reminded to recertify. The answer is yes. They are reminded to do that. Right now, at least, it doesn't sort of provide the ability for a borrower to come back to us and say, like, I no longer actually work in qualifying employment, please leave me alone, or I'm just no longer interested in this program, leave me alone. That's something that we have on a list of like things that we can explore, and that frankly, that's another reason why the data we have may not be as insightful as we would like, but yes, they are reminded.
I was wondering, is there any guidance we can give borrowers who are finding reluctance from their employer to complete the paperwork? For a specific example, a provisionally employed police officer who's worked 50-plus hours a week for the last year cannot get the employer to fill that out because technically it's a provisional employment, even though they've been there, they're making their payments, they're doing everything.
Yeah, so the question was around what to recommend borrowers, or frankly anyone who's counseling them, do if employers are reluctant to certify employment on the PSLF employment certification form. That's a problem we hear about every now and then, only anecdotally. We don't really have a good way of quantifying the extent to which it occurs, but we are aware that it sometimes happens. There are a few different things that we do to try to assuage people that, you know, the Department of Education police aren't going to show up and like break your legs if you like fill the form out wrong. One of the things that we do in the Q&As on our website, which is a place that we try to point employers to, is a question that's specifically targeted at employers about the use of the information that they provide to us, and that will only be used for our programmatic purposes and nothing else. One thing I'm not sure of, and your question's sort of prompting me to file this away, is we consider someone to be employed for the purposes of PSLF if the organization issues a W-2 to them. So if, in the case of this police officer, if the employer is unwilling to certify because the employer isn't sure, like, is this person an employee or not, it's a very simple test for us. Do they issue a W-2? If yes, then they are an employee and they shouldn't be concerned at all about certifying. But I don't know if we say that very clearly on our website, so I'll put that on a list of things to check out when I get home. Thanks.
The number one question I get from future grads and graduates is if they sign up for the program and then it goes away. What are the chances that they'll either be grandfathered in? And I don't know how to answer that, and I'm wondering if you can give me guidance on how to answer that.
Yeah, it's one of our most frequently asked questions. The question was about what happens if I sign up for PSLF or don't, but the program eventually goes away. Of course, PSLF was created in statute, the Higher Education Act. It would take another act of Congress to modify or eliminate the PSLF program. I certainly can't comment and don't recommend that anyone do so too strongly about whether or not should Congress change or modify the program, who or to what extent anyone would be grandfathered into the PSLF program that existed when they signed their NPN or they started taking out loans. But I would say that basically what I just said is exactly what is on our website. And so in the Q&A section of the PSLF website, to backtrack, it's studentaid.gov/public service. There's a series of Q's and A's in there, and I think actually like question number 2 is exactly the one that you just highlighted. So I'd recommend plagiarizing from our website. If you're talking about an answer about whether or not you actually qualify for TEPSLF, it's going to highly depend on whether or not this is somebody we've literally never heard from before about public service loan forgiveness, in which case you need to work your way through the entire PSLF process before we can even get you to the TEPSLF process. Or if this is someone who had been certifying and maybe just sort of like fell off the bandwagon later on in repayment, or wants payments from earlier on after they opted into PSLF tracking, to get an answer. So like, I don't think that we have really good timeframes established yet for what we think is reasonable for a response, because again, the program is relatively new. If you have a specific borrower where you think this is taking an inordinate amount of time, FedLoan is shaking their head yes, so you should come bug these two ladies up towards the front. Yeah.
Referencing back to the annual recertification process, in addition to reminding borrowers to please complete that ECF if they've already expressed an interest in PSLF, is there also a plan to regress them to this new tool that's being rolled out?
Yes. I don't know if we'll be doing, how we will incorporate that into communications surrounding reminders to do ECFs or not. But I do know that one of the outreach plans that we have after we launched the tool to help provide information to all direct loan borrowers about the requirements for PSLF is to direct them to this tool. And so it is forming part of our outreach strategies. Unfortunately, I don't know if it will be incorporated into the letter that FedLoan Servicing already sends, but they're in the room, so they're certainly hearing your feedback.
Big buttons on the interface.
Got it. So the question was about whether or not you need to work for 3 years after you've made 120 qualifying payments. The answer is no. Make 120 qualifying payments, apply for PSLF while you're still working for the employer, and if you qualify, you'll get it. There's no waiting period.
One slide you talked about Parent Plus loans. Are Grad Plus loans needing to be consolidated before they apply for PSLF?
Yeah, so the question was about Parent Plus loans needing to be consolidated and whether or not the same thing is true for Grad Plus loans. The answer is no. Grad Plus loans don't need to be consolidated to be set up for what I call PSLF success. The reason for the distinction is that Parent Plus loans are only eligible for one IDR plan, and that's income contingent repayment, and they're only eligible for it if the parent consolidates their Parent Plus loans. That restriction does not exist for Graduate Plus loans, which are generally eligible for all of the income-driven plans, so they don't need to be consolidated.
One more quick thing, the online tool, the ETF online tool, is there going to be a way for the borrower to submit that electronically? Because I think now it's only faxing or mailing in.
Yeah, that's right, at least for the initial launch, and the question was about how people can submit forms that are generated through the PSLF help tool. At least at first, the answer is no. Borrowers will be given pre-populated PDFs that they can take to their employer and have the employer sign, and they would be submitted through existing submission mechanisms, which would be, at least for someone who hasn't opted into PSLF tracking yet, is mail or fax. For anyone who is already at FedLoan Servicing, either because they've opted into PSLF tracking or because they were the borrower servicer the entire time, borrowers can upload PSLF forms directly on FedLoan Servicing site without the need to mail or fax.
Several very specific types of questions. Would the table downstairs be able to answer?
Certainly, the question is about very specific questions they have about PSLF. Yeah, if you go down to the FedLoan Servicing representatives in particular, I know they can answer it. I'm also happy to, like, after the session's over, talk to you if, you know, there are more programmatic questions about what qualifies or not. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm wondering about the other servicers, not FedLoan Servicing, and what steps you all are taking to make sure that the other services are giving out accurate and complete information about PSLF. And I'm thinking of the scenario where the ECF is not required, and so sometimes borrowers hear from their other servicer, oh, you're interested in PSLF, you can stay with us, you don't need to submit the ECF, which technically is true, but then that
Yeah, so the question is about to what extent we have the ability or are tracking or ensuring that servicers other than Fed loan servicing are recommending the use of employment certification forms. I'm certainly not from our oversight area, and so I can't get too much into detail about what type of oversight we do in this area, but I will say that several years ago, I believe, and I'm speaking from memory, which is generally dangerous, but I think we modified all of the other servicers' contracts to specifically require them to recommend the use of the PSLF employment certification form when the borrower indicates that they are interested in the program. And so if you have cases that you're aware of from the last several years, I want to hear about them because it would be a violation of their contractual requirements and we could take action on that pretty easily.
Thank you.
Mhm.
My question is in regards to how much outreach is the department of Ed doing with HR offices for companies that you know are eligible based on their 503C status for government?
Yeah, so it's so far our direct outreach, sorry, the question was about to what extent we're doing outreach to HR offices for employers that we know qualify. First of all, I'll say that there are a lot of qualifying employers, and so we haven't found an easy way to take it upon ourselves to directly reach out to, in particular, HR offices for whom we wouldn't even necessarily have good contact information for, to advise them that they're a qualifying employer and what they should be telling their employees, et cetera. I do know that we have done outreach, at least federal government-wide, where we've talked to HR offices for every federal agency so that the HR offices are ready, willing, and able to certify employment, et cetera, and know what to tell employees who come to them. We've talked about but haven't found the best way to execute a similar strategy for state and local governments, but it's something that we're aware of. If we could find the right sort of point of contact, we could get messages to those offices with relative ease. But when it comes to the 501c3 category of qualifying employment, frankly, I don't know how we would do that, at least not well. Which isn't to say that if you don't have an idea that I'm not happy to listen to it, I am, or if anybody has an idea about how to contact HR offices for nonprofits, I'm happy to hear about it, but we haven't gotten that far yet.
So I was just curious as to, getting questions from folks outside, but what is the verbiage that is being used when students call in or when borrowers call in and inquire about should they be doing, say, PSLF or income-based, one of those income-based programs versus going into a forbearance type situation? Because we've had even staff members in our own financial aid office who were ill-advised to go into forbearance while they're in a qualifying job, and thus their applications were some of those that were denied in this first wave. So then the suggestion comes, could we look at that and potentially have some type of relief, and maybe it is, maybe I misunderstood, for those students who were in those forbearance type situations when in actuality they were employed in a qualifying job, would have qualified for some type of IDR plan, but now we're denied. We have to now keep working for an extra 1.5 to 2 years.
Yeah, so I don't know that there's a specific script that either FedLoan has or that we've created or given them to use, or that the same would be true for any of our other servicers. I think that's usually, with limited exceptions, something that we leave to their discretion about how best to counsel a borrower. And of course, it's highly fact-specific in so many cases, and I know as professionals you all deal with miscommunication issues all the time. Two people walk away feeling that they had fundamentally different conversations. So this is hard, first of all. I would say that if you have individual cases where you feel like it's very obvious that this person was, especially if they were saying like, hey, I want to get PSLF, and the servicer said, oh, okay, here's a forbearance, like that we would regard that as highly problematic. Oftentimes what I have personally found in this space, and it's anecdotal at best, so I don't know how indicative of it is of reality, is that the borrower doesn't disclose quite as much there's not really quite a magic word that a borrower needs to say, but sometimes the borrower feels like it was clear that they indicated that they were gunning for PSLF, and the CSR maybe reasonably or not, reasonable minds could disagree, provided enough information to provide the best counseling to the borrower. And so again, this is hard. I'm not really answering your question, and I'm sorry. But if you have cases where you feel like it's very clear that there was a servicing problem, let me know. We do, when there are cases of clear servicer error where information that the servicer provided caused the borrower to do something to the borrower's detriment or service the borrower's account incorrectly, to provide what we call override credit for periods of time during which the borrower was prevented from making qualifying payments due to the conduct of his or her servicer, either Fed Loan Servicing or literally any other servicer for our portfolio. Basically, the way that a borrower would identify themselves as being in that category, and they certainly would need to identify that they're in that category, is basically to call Fed Loan Servicing and say, my servicer said something wrong, I want credit anyway. And then that will go through an escalation process where we'll, review to try to determine whether or not that existed.
Very good, thank you. And then also, I just want to second that our students and alumni at this point have had a long, long wait period, like 4 to 5 to 6 months for questions about their PSLF or IDR plans. So it would be great if we could look at that a little more.
Yeah, I understand. I really can't stress enough how hard it is to review the documentation that Fed Loan Servicing has to review, particularly with respect to whether the qualifying payments. The employment and the qualifying loan piece is generally pretty easy, but when it comes to reviewing the documentation that they have to review to figure out whether or not any given payment qualifies, it's very hard. And I know that's not a good answer to your question. I want it to be faster too. Again, it's one of the reasons why the early and often message with respect to submitting employment certification forms is so important, because the tracking of qualifying payments after a borrower opts in is automated for payments that they make while they're at Fed Loan. And so there really isn't this lag period that there is if they waited and had been at multiple servicers before getting there. So I'm sorry, but I don't have a good answer. Yeah.
I stepped out for a second, so I apologize if this is already asked, but some of the programs, once the student marries, the spouse is included, and some they're not. Is that touched on in the next session?
It is. We have 4 or 5 slides all about that.
Okay, great, thank you.
One thing that I've gotten questions about, and I know our system does it automatically because it goes through NSLDS, when a student, especially a student who's in the public service loan forgiveness, and they go back to school, and then they get thrown into the in-school deferment, sometimes they're not aware of it, and then they're like, they think there's no hope that they can get themselves, because they want to make the payment. Some don't want the deferment. They want to make the payment because they're still working and they're on the income-driven plan. They can afford the payment, and it flips them off the plan. Or they're informed they're back in school and they don't think they can go back to get themselves back on the plan. I don't know if Fed Loans sends out something going, hey, just an FYI, you're on the PSL, we know it's payments, you're now in an in-school deferment, you can go back and make payments. I've had 2 employees that have come, and all I tell them is you just have to call, and one was frustrated because it was like every time it just kept on flipping over, and I think that was about a year ago, so it could have been corrected or she got done with school. So that's usually the biggest issue that I've gotten questions about.
Yeah, so the question for everybody else is what happens, or what type of outreach is done to a borrower who goes back to school. As you all know, when that happens, borrowers' loans are automatically placed back into an in-school deferment status based on enrollment information in NSLDS. Of course, as you all now know, if you didn't already, you can't make qualifying payments while you're under deferment. You need to be on an income-driven plan to make the qualifying payments. Unlike an in-school status, which borrowers can't opt out of, they can opt out of an in-school deferment. And again, I'm just going to say what I always say when anyone asks me a question about PSLF. This is another reason why submitting the employment certification form early and often is very important. It allows us, and by us, mostly I mean Fed Loan, to actually do targeted PSLF sensitive outreach to borrowers. And so like we discussed when we were talking through the data about Borrowers who are under deferment or forbearance, even though they submitted an employment certification form, FedLoan does reach out to them when that happens, but only if we know that you want PSLF. I think FedLoan servicing also has the ability to allow students to opt out of an in-school deferment, not just based on the most recent employment data, enrollment data that came into NSLDS, but also for future enrollment information that you get. So the case of it flipping back and forth, if that were at FedLoan servicing, I think I would be somewhat surprised by it. I do know for a fact that some other servicers do handle things in that manner. And so it could be that the person that you were dealing with was not with FedLoan. But if it was, then again, this is another case of I'd want to hear about it because I would perceive that as problematic.
And then just an FYI for your outreach, you guys should hook up to when you file your taxes. That's how I tell my employee. I say when you do your taxes, that's when you should get your enrollment certification from your employer. Every April 15th taxes and certify your employer, and then file it away, and then you have it. So just if you want to piggyback a date. So.
Thank you.
Can you confirm that if a borrower is on IDR plan and because their income is so low, their payments are actually zero, that those zero payments for that 12 months until they resubmit do count towards 120?
Yeah, for borrowers who have calculated income-driven repayment amounts of $0 per month, which can happen, for income-driven plans, if they happen to also be working for a qualifying employer full-time, I wouldn't perceive that to be the norm. Hopefully somebody isn't earning so little that, they're below the poverty line, but we know it, it happens. Those payments, using air quotes here, because no actual money came in, those months of $0 payments when they were calculated that way do count towards PSLF.
Yes, piggybacking on the lady that was here just before me, one of the things that I found on that, because it happens to my students, is that they're on a PSLF program, they're making their payments, they come to the school, and of course, it tells them they're in an in-school deferment. But the other issue is that they take out more financial aid to continue their education. And it keeps putting them in that in-school deferment because of those new loans. But they still want to pay on the old loans that they had from undergraduate. So that's what I'm wondering is, can they do that? Because they've been given information that they've been told, no, they can't because they're in an in-school deferment.
Yeah.
Yes, they are for the loans that they've taken out for graduate school, but not for the undergraduate school. So how is that handled?
So for a borrower who has a mix of loans that had entered repayment previously and so were placed into an in-school deferment status, and those who are but also have loans that they've just recently taken out which have never entered deferment, meaning that they're in an in-school status, they can waive the in-school deferment on the loans that had previously entered repayment, but they cannot waive the in-school status for the loans that they've, in your example, received for graduate school. Unless we're talking about plus loans, which of course, technically in a repayment as soon as they're fully dispersed. So for a borrower who is really trying to get PSLF as quickly as possible on however many loans they can, they would have to, again, call their servicer and say, for all of these loans that are in an in-school deferment, I want to opt out ever of receiving an in-school deferment on those loans unless I tell you otherwise. And I think most servicers have a way to handle that. I know FedLoan Servicing does, but I'm not sure if that's true for all servicers, but it is possible to basically split the difference.
Hi. So when borrowers consolidate their loans, that means they reset the clock on their payments for PSLF, right?
Correct.
So how is your tool going to counsel borrowers who may have been making kind of qualifying payments on like undergraduate loans and then have something like Pell loans or graduate loans afterwards and not lose their progress that they've made?
Yeah, it's a good question. The question is about how the tool will target counseling such that only loans that need to be consolidated in the PSLF help tool will are the loans that you'll be told to consolidate. There are a few different screens in this help tool. The one that you saw didn't provide the most detail that a borrower will actually be provided with. It was sort of an upfront check about, there's going to be more action steps for you. At the very end, it's sort of like a confirmation page. Borrowers will receive loan level information that basically says, here are the loans that you need to consolidate, here are the loans that you need to get on income-driven repayment. And so when they do ultimately make good on the information that we provided to them and go into the consolidation application, they know what loans they need to look for. And I think, I haven't seen the language in a while, but I think it also reminds them that the consolidation application automatically assumes that you want to consolidate all of your loans, and so provides an instruction to them on the confirmation page that says, uncheck any loan that you don't see here, or you may lose credit towards PSLF. So we tried to handle that as best we can, but it requires a borrower to read and understand and follow instructions, and people do that, but not everyone.
Is there any kind of like recourse for borrowers who are counseled to consolidate their loans perhaps by their servicer, and they do consolidate and they lose progress for PSLF and having them get discounted?
Yeah, so we are out of time, like right now, but since my session is next in this room, I don't really care. The question was about what happens when borrowers are improperly counseled to consolidate their loans such that they lose credit towards PSLF that they had already earned on their direct loans. Like the question about misservicing before, this would fall into that category. It would come down to whether or not the servicer knew or had a reason to know that the borrower was interested in PSLF and had been making what they thought were qualifying payments, and whether or not the servicer had enough information to basically know that they should have told the borrower not to consolidate everything. But if that does happen, then we have provided, again, what we call override credit to cases where we found that that does occur, and it's basically on the borrower to call and object and advocate for themselves when these types of cases arise. I think they could also probably file a complaint through the FSA complaint system. Anything else? All right. There's a gentleman over here.
Just a question on PSLF and full-time employment. Is it possible for a person to have two jobs? One job is his full-time job, and the other job is another full-time job, but that other full-time job is a 501c3, but he doesn't make any money? Let's say like a volunteer firefighter.
Oh, okay. So the question is about two qualifying jobs. One for a 501c3 where you make no money, and one full-time where I assume that you're paid. Volunteerism doesn't qualify for PSLF. You need to be a bona fide employee of an organization, which is to say someone who is being paid, earning a salary, and who is issued a W-2 in order to be considered an employee. So in your example, we would only consider the borrower to be employed by one employer.
So in the case of where a borrower has loans that are qualifying with their payments, and then they have others that are not, they go through the consolidation, that, to me, may have them have two tracks of payments. How do they do the
Okay, I'm in here next, so you can send them.
verification form and the applications when they have like two sets? So they have like, maybe they have 8 years left on this, but then they just consolidated this, and now they start their 10 years over again. How do you guys manage the forms for that?
So PSLF operates on what we call a loan level. It's a loan-based benefit. You need to make 120 qualifying payments on the loans for which you want forgiveness. So in your example, if the borrower has two sets of consolidation loans, they just follow different tracks. So in your example, the loans that were maybe consolidated 8 years ago may only have 2 years left for forgiveness, and the loans that were just consolidated may have the full 10 years left. That's fine. In fact, that's how the program was designed to operate. Once the borrower hits 10 years on that first set of loans, they would submit a PSLF application. Assuming that they actually do qualify on that first set of loans, they would get an approval letter that says, we discharged these loans, but we didn't discharge these loans because you're not there yet. And so the borrower could continue to submit employment certification forms for that second set of loans until they hit 10 years on that set, and then they would submit another application and hopefully get the remainder forgiven. Did that answer your question? Okay.
I heard you say that you can
Absolutely, you can always opt out of a deferment for your loans. Again, to be clear, I'm talking about a deferment status, not an in-school status. Yeah.
Just kept thinking about another tag onto my question. Could you foresee in the future that using the data retrieval tool on your certification process could also identify the employer and thus eliminate the need to get the paper signed by the employer?
If wishing made it so.
The police officer's my son.
Oh.
So it's like, how do you go to the county building and say, listen, I just came back from a federal student aid conference. You guys are really warm up right now.
Yeah, I mean, you should definitely go to the, county office and say exactly that. But at the same time, there have been a very limited number of these cases where employers have refused to sign, but some ardently refuse to sign under any circumstance. I don't know why this is the case. I don't know why someone would not want to provide this benefit to their employees, especially since it costs employers nothing. But
Civil service, so he's a provisional employee until he is officially, the civil service.
sure. And so we do have a process built in. It's not the most borrower-friendly, it requires a lot of documentation, but for someone for whom the employer will not certify, we will accept documentation of employment that's not through an employment certification form that's signed by the employer. There's basically a box that you check on the form that says my employer refused to do this for me, and you submit that without any documentation, and then Fed Loan Servicing gets back to you and provides, I'm saying this somewhat flippantly, but here's the laundry list of stuff we need to figure out what you qualify for. But we do have some process to handle that. I've exhausted you. Oh, no, I haven't. I take it all back.
So you said on the back end, there's no continual service needed to qualify for it after 4 years, they don't tack them back on. But what about the front end? Is there a minimum amount of employment somebody has to have before they can apply for the PLF?
Yeah, so the question is about whether or not there's a minimum period of employment that you need before you can get PSLF. The answer is yes, it's 10 years. So the 120 qualifying payments need to be made at the same time that you are employed by a qualifying employer. That doesn't mean that you can't get credit for a payment until a specific period of time has passed, really. As soon as you make the payment during a period of employment, that month can count. But you can't actually get PSLF until you have the 10 years of employment and payments in a line.
What about the ECF form? ECF form, is there a minimum amount of time before one can submit one?
No, there's no minimum period of time you need to wait before submitting an employment certification form. Generally, we recommend people wait a few months so that they've made a few payments and had a few months of employment to document to be sure that, obviously there's no utility in submitting it when you don't have the job yet or anything, but yeah, there's no minimum period you need to wait before submitting.
From personal experience, while helping the students, we ran into a barrier that said at least 9 months of employment before taking the next step forward. And I'm just wondering what form we might have been looking at. Obviously, it was either of those.
Yeah, you stumped me. I have no idea. If you have details that you could provide to me, I can help track it down. More, okay.
Is there actually a place that students can go to find the EIN number for their employer?
We tell borrowers, and this would only really work after they've worked there past the end of a calendar year, but obviously the W-2, hopefully people are retaining those. That's sort of the easiest sort of self-help way for a borrower to figure out what the EIN is for their employer, but they can certainly also ask the HR office, which would be infinitely familiar with what their EIN is. Hi.
Sorry.
No.
So about 22,000 people have applied for PSLF but have been denied. I'm wondering why those people have been denied, and if y'all are going to publish a breakdown of why they've been denied, and if there's any outreach to kind of people.
Yeah, so the question was around the large number of denials for PSLF, and basically if we're going to do a breakdown of why they were denied and what we're doing to, help them along their merry way. A large majority, and I think this was on one of our data slides,
Yeah, it's in there. It's like 70% or it's a large majority of that. But I was wondering if there's more specific of a breakdown, like how many of them as payments, how many of them as loans.
So I don't know that, I haven't seen that level of a breakdown yet. I don't know if it's one that we're in the process of producing or if it's one that we already have produced and I just haven't seen it yet. I would say that we would also have to understand that there are multiple reasons for any individual borrower. And so, I mean, that's not an excuse for not having the data already. It's just, something we would have to bear in mind as we produce that type of data that would cause it to take more time. I would say that borrowers, when they are denied PSLF, are told the reason why that is the case and what it is that they can do. Of course, if they believe that the information is incorrect or if they were misled by, say, their servicer, as we've mentioned, we have that process in place. Again, all of these processes, however, require the borrower to get on the phone and advocate for himself or herself, which I understand can be intimidating for a lot of people, but it is where we are right now, at least. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone.